Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our online distance learning Algebra 1 with Mr. Hagedorn. Today we are going through lesson 8.4, which is solving quadratics by using the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula was actually created when someone decided to take ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0 and solve it for x by completing the square. I'll have a link to that on our homeroom page, so if you were interested to see how that looks, you can take a look at the video there. But what they got out of it was x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And actually the b squared minus 4ac also goes by the name the discriminant, and it determines the number and type of solutions that we have, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. So let's take a look at this and let's use it. And the big thing that we are going to have to do is realize that, one, our equation has to be in standard form, has to be ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And we have to know that a, b, and c are going to be substituted in and used mathematically. So if you can do those two things correctly, this should be a piece of cake. So let's take a look at the example that we have. It says solve 2x squared minus 5 equals 3x. So in this case, in order to do that, to get it into standard form, which is step 1, we have to subtract 3x from both sides. If we do that, that would leave us with 2x squared minus 3x minus 5 is equal to 0. Now once we have our equation in standard form, the next step would be to substitute values into the quadratic formula and simplify. So if we did that, it would look something like this. X equals the opposite of b, so the opposite of negative 3 is positive 3, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so negative 3 squared, minus 4, which is part of the equation, times a, which is 2, times c, which is negative 5, and this is all going to be divided by 2 times a, which in this case is also 2. So now what we're going to need to do is, first things first, let's figure out this square root, okay? So let's figure out the discriminant under it first of all. So negative 3 squared is 9, minus 4 times 2 times negative 5 is negative 40. So 9 minus negative 40, or 9 plus 40, is 49. And as you know, 49 is a perfect square, and the square root of 49 is 7. So we figured that out. In the denominator, 2 times 2 is 4. So this would leave us with the statement 3 plus or minus 7 over 4. Once we figured out the discriminant in the denominator, the last part of our simplifying is to do the addition and subtraction. So in this case, 3 plus 7 is 10, and 10 divided by 4 is 2.5, or 3 minus 7 is negative 4, and negative 4 divided by 4 is negative 1. So again, ladies and gentlemen, it's always good to remember to check your equation, or check your answers in your original equation to make sure you've done everything correctly. So if we put 2.5 in for x, 2.5 squared times 2 is 12.5, and 12.5 minus 5 is 7.5. On the other side, 3 times 2.5 is also 7.5, so it checks out. If we plug in negative 1, negative 1 squared times 2 is 2, minus 5 is negative 3, and 3 times negative 3, or 3 times negative 1 is also negative 3. So again, ladies and gentlemen, if you do everything correctly, your answers will check out. If you've made a mistake along the way and your answer doesn't work, go back and check your steps. All right? So now I've got a couple more examples here I just want to go through with you to show you the what-if scenarios, things that could happen not in the process, but in the product or your solution. Okay? So the first example I'd like to go through with you here is 8x squared plus 8 is equal to 6 minus 9x. So for this one, first thing we're going to do is we're going to get it into standard form. To do that, we are going to subtract 6 from both sides, and we are going to add 9x to both sides. When we do that, what it leaves us with is now a quadratic in standard form. So it leaves us with 8x squared plus 9x plus 2 is equal to 0. So now that we have that in standard form, once again, all we need to do here, ladies and gentlemen, is to substitute the values in correctly. So this would leave us with x is equal to the opposite of b, negative 9, plus or minus the square root of 9 squared minus 4 times 8 times 2 all over 2 times 8. So there's our substitution, ladies and gentlemen. There's everything that we have. So now we find the value of our discriminant, what's underneath the square root. So in this case, that would leave us with 9 squared, which is 81, minus 4 times 8 times 2 is 64, and 81 minus 64 is 17. 17 is not a perfect square, which is okay. There's no problem. All we have to do now is realize that our answer is going to contain an irrational number. It's going to contain the square root of 17. And the denominator, 2 times 8, is 16. So in this case, that would leave us with the following. X is equal to negative 9 plus or minus the square root of 17 over 16. And since the square root of 17 does not have a square root, an exact square root, this is our exact answer. If this were a word problem or an algebraic model, my guess would be we would round the square root of 17 to the nearest tenth and then give the answer as an approximate answer. But anytime you're just doing straight algebra, I want you to leave the answer as an exact answer, which in this case involves the square root of 17. Okay? So that's it. We're done with that problem. Now the next one brings another scenario into play. Let's go through that one together. So in this case, we have 7x squared minus 4x plus 11 is equal to 3. So for this one, first step, get it into standard form, is to subtract 3 from both sides. When we do that, ladies and gentlemen, that leaves us with 7x squared minus 4x plus 8 is equal to 0. So in all three examples, our first step is to make sure it's in standard form. And our second step is to substitute properly. So in this case, to do that, that would leave us with x is equal to the opposite of b, 4, plus or minus the square root of negative 4 squared minus 4 times 7 times 8 all over 2 times 7. So now we're at the point again where we figure out the discriminant, what's under the square root. So in this case, negative 4 squared is 16 minus 4 times 7 times 8 is 224, which leaves us with the answer negative 208. So that right there, ladies and gentlemen, is the other scenario that we could run across. What happens if your discriminant is negative? Well, since you know that if you try to take the square root of a negative number, your calculator always gives you an error message. And the reason that is because it doesn't exist. So because the square root of negative 208 doesn't exist, then the answer to this problem also doesn't exist. So if you ever run across a problem where your discriminant or the number underneath the square root is negative, your answer ends up being no solution. So those, ladies and gentlemen, are the different scenarios, different types of answers that you can run across where you have two rational answers like we did in our first example. You have two irrational answers like we have in our second example, or an answer that involves a square root that's not a perfect square. And the last one is when there's no solution at all because you're dealing with the square root of a negative number. All right, so that's all I have for you today, ladies and gentlemen. Again, if you do have questions, please make sure you bring them to class. And as always, stay healthy, stay safe, and Lord's blessings on your day. We'll see you soon.